Yes, you may have the same feeling.
I'd like to welcome you this evening to this League of Women Voters event. I think we have more chairs in the back. Okay, if we need it. Well, welcome to this evening. I have a couple of quick announcements hopefully quick announcements that I want to do prior to having Judy introduce our speaker this evening. And first of all, one is from Carol Erickson, who asked me to kind of have you save the date, December 4th, for the holiday or the December gathering and the speaker. More information will be coming, and which leads me into a couple of other things. First of all, you did receive an email from Jim and Stephanie regarding Ann Berry, who passed away. And her funeral services are this coming Saturday. And again, details are probably, and just check your email, they will be in there. And by the way, Ann Berry was a 50-year member of this particular group. I'm not sure it was just this league, but league in general. But anyway, please remember your family and your thoughts. And which leads me into, also just a little plug, check our website occasionally, LWB, RosevilleArea.org. All one word, Roseville area, because that's where you can kind of get some up-to-date information, and there's two on league happenings. And also just mentioned to John Marty, that the candidate forums are already on our Facebook. The ones that we've had are already posted on Facebook. And the one that from just last evening is not up yet. And we are going, I talked to Barb Anderson, they're going to be on our website too, in the YouTube folder. I just have to give a quick shout out to our voter services people this year. Headed up by Cecilia Warner, there was Karen Lake, Lois Cunningham, Emma Duran, Sherry Hood, Judy Stuckman here, who doing these candidate forums is getting to be a little bit tricky and more problematic every year, not just for our area. Actually, our area has done quite well, it's been going quite well, but throughout the state. And I won't go into the litany of issues that have occurred, but I really thank them for what they've done. Then, in addition to that, Sherry Hood and Judy Stuckman and a friend of Sherry's, Martha O'Toole, took on a project at Roseville High School in the American Studies classes, 4 classes with one particular teacher. And they went in for one session, and I just sat in on one of their sessions, whereby they talked about voting, the whole history of voting in the United States and voting rights. And then they segued into the process to become a new citizen. And I really like the way Martha started out with 10 questions of these high school students. They had put pencil to a paper and answer some of these questions that, of course, are required about people going through the process of gaining citizenship. And of course, there are a lot of groans. These are 17 and 18-year-olds at 9 o'clock in the morning, so lots of groaning. But it was a really good, I think, experience for them. I was so excited about what they had done. And I thought, aha, I really think League could be on to something in this education process, especially if we have a particular teacher that's interested in this in the high school. And taking out, just 45 minutes during that trimester to go through this process. And also the exposure is for League too. So anyway, we're going down the halls at the Roseville High School that morning after the 9:15 class, and they had already done a class earlier, and I was just pumped about this. I thought, oh my gosh, just think about this. This is one trimester, and this could happen 3 times, in a year. Think how many students that we could actually expose this information to. And I'm just kind of going on and on about, in my mind, about the ideas. And all of a sudden, Judy and Martha and Sherry just did this quick turn, looked me in the eye and said, at 8:15 in the morning? So we have to go back to the drawing board and think about how we do this and encourage people who might want to participate in this. And if you are like me, you probably know some, might have some friends, neighbors who have been a little bit anxiety-ridden in this particular election season with the rhetoric and everything that has happened. And you're talking about, rather than maybe looking into getting a therapist or a prescription for Xanax, think about joining League of Women Voters. It's a sane organization with people where you get to meet people that are interested in discussing issues. And so keep that in mind. So if you can spread the word with these little business cards and membership brochures, which are in the back, that would be very helpful, because I think you might calm a few nerves as people might start sleeping there. So with that in mind, what I do is maybe sometimes take a deep breath and I refresh myself with the League mission. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that does not support a candidates, nor parties. Rather, encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. And with that, Judy will introduce our speakers.
John Marty has been our state senator since 1987, and he lives in Roseville with his wife Connie, who we are very happy to have with us tonight, though we don't see exactly where she's sitting right now. They live in Roseville and they have 2 adult children. John was born in Illinois, came to Minnesota to attend St. Olaf College and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Ethics. He's been a strong advocate on environmental protection issues, including renewable energy. He's worked tirelessly on healthcare reform, supporting universal health care, and he's focused on government ethics and campaign finance reform. He does not accept soft money contributions or contributions from lobbyists, and he limits the contributions he will accept from any one person. As many of us know, he's responsive to his constituents and has been handily reelected. Currently, he is the chair of the Senate Environment and Energy Commission and the co-chair of the Legislative Energy Commission. Throughout his career, he's focused on prevention, addressing challenges up front to build a better future and prevent problems before they start. We are very pleased to welcome Senator Marty here tonight.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and last night thank the League for sponsoring the candidate forums. And I thought it was, last night's forum, for those of you who were not there, it was really impressive. We had 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and when we got to talking about immigration as an issue, it sounded like a normal conversation between a country of immigrants, which was really impressive to me, since probably 98% of us are from immigrant families somewhere along the line. And instead of the rhetoric that's going on in Washington and just about everywhere else, there was not a single negative comment by any of the candidates of either party. Every one of them was saying how they've been a benefit to the community, how we have to work to help them integrate in their challenges. But I thought it was so normal that you wish our political process could get to that kind of thing once again. And tonight's topic, I think, is one of those that relates to a lot of our problems in our democracy. I'm a strong believer in the idea of a representative democracy and the idea that people and the ideas they have should be debated and widely discussed and argued about, and even arguing and yelling at each other is okay if you're trying to make a case for a point. But in our system, we've kind of turned the money over to, it's the thing that dominates things. And I know people often say, oh, that's not true. I've yet to see anybody who says, oh, money's not the main factor in election. I've yet to see any interest group, any super PAC, any candidate say, well, money's not the factor, and even though I got more money than you, it doesn't matter. So I'll gladly give you my treasury and you give me your treasury. Nobody will do that because they understand money does make a difference. I think the impact of money in our politics in the most cynical way, but unfortunately sometimes too true, though not talked about this way. I'm going to go back to a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania in 1896, Boys Penrose, in a speech to railroad tycoons and other wealthy contributors. He said something that I think very few politicians would be so blunt as to say these days. He said, "I believe in the division of labor. You send us to Congress, we pass laws under which you make money, and out of your profits you further contribute to our campaign funds to send us back again to pass more laws to enable you to make more money." This guy actually, that was before we had direct election of U.S. senators, but he served a bit of time in Washington and was not attacked for that. I don't know if that was a speech that became public at some point or not. Bill Moyers, so I think many of us have respected his discussions of this issue over the years. He wrote a cover story on the magazine Sojourners back in the late 90s. This is a decade or more before the Citizens United decision, and probably campaign spending was probably an eighth or ninth what it is now, because it seems to double every 5 or 6 years, so it's growing exponentially. But Bill Moyers wrote a cover story. It was titled, "Big Money's Assault on Our Democracy is Not as Bad as You Think, period. It's worse." I didn't have to say the last 2 words, because when you say period, you kind of get the sense there's something else coming. And he is not somebody who's naive and saying, "Oh, no, people just don't get it," because I think you'll get a lot of political insiders who will say, "Oh, no, I can't be bought by any money. I'm not, no, it doesn't influence me." A lot of people inside the system defend it to varying degrees. Fewer and fewer are saying it's a good system, but many still defend it. And I think that the reason being is most of our colleagues, and I've got Alice Hausman here and former Representative Godwin here, I think they would agree that most of our colleagues in both parties are not crooks. They are not people, if you came up to them with an envelope full of $1,000 in cash and said, "Here, I want to give you a little something, and by the way, we need a favor," I think 90-some%, I hope 99.9% of our colleagues would chase them out of the room. Maybe not because they didn't want to accept it, but because they were afraid they might be caught, perhaps. But I think most people, I don't mean to say that too cynically, though, because I really think most of our people who really don't see themselves as crooks. And they're not. And the problem isn't that we've got crooked people in politics. The problem is a corrupt system. The only thing I'd accuse my colleagues of is being 100% human. And we all, it's not like somebody does a huge favor for you and you say, spit in your face. We're human beings and we have this natural psychological urge for reciprocity, and it makes a difference in how we do things. And we don't recognize it, but it's a system that is corrupted by it. It corrupts us in many ways. First time I ran, 1986, I wasn't supposed to win. My opponent, the spending limits are voluntary in Minnesota, you don't have to abide by them. I spent very close to the limit of, I think it was $35,000 at the time. My opponent skipped the limit, spent about $55,000 or $60,000. He got money from all these interest groups and everything. And right after the election, I think about 3 days after, got a very nice letter from a lobbyist at the Capitol who was representing a number of groups, one of the lobbyists who has many clients. And he wrote me a very nice letter, handwritten letter, saying, "Congratulations on your election. You showed hard work really does make a difference." Because again, I wasn't expected to win. He said, "One of my clients had the misfortune of giving a contribution to your opponent. Here's a contribution as they wish to make amends." Now, I don't have to tell you what the issue was. It was a medical-related one, but a very specialized one that there are about 2 interest groups that care about, one on each side of the issue. I don't even remember which side of the issue this group was on. And I would care to bet that nobody in that group had any clue what my opponent's position on the issue was. And they had no clue what my position on the issue was, because frankly, I'd never talked about it in the campaign, and I had 35 pages of issue papers, which some of you who were around back then may remember seeing. But I talked about just about every issue, but I never talked about that one, and I'm sure they didn't know. Why did they give money to him? Because he was going to win. They wanted him, they wanted favor with a friend. He lost. They had the misfortune, that was their misfortune, they guessed wrong on who was going to win. So they wish to make amends. And I understand that. We all understand that that's the way politics works. And when you look at how it compares to other aspects of society, I like to use an analogy to help explain it. And to do that, I'll start with a business owner from the East Coast who had no interest in Minnesota politics, never gave any money. 2004, 0 contributions to anybody in the state. 2006, he gave $20,000 to the DFL party and $20,000 to the Republican Party. He gave $5,000 to each of the 3 candidates for governor, and I think he gave roughly the same amounts to Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans and House Democrats and House Republicans, about $90,000. And he kept doing so. Why did this guy decide to start giving money in Minnesota politics? It was a New Jersey businessman who bought a team called the Minnesota Vikings. And he had an interest in something in our state, and he wanted to be a player. And we say he's a very big player in politics, not one of the biggest ones, but he's a factor. He can give money, and he sees it as his civic duty to give money to campaigns. And he did push, and I can't prove that those contributions made any difference whatsoever. But in the end, in 2012, I think it was, he got a subsidy that I broke it down in numbers. I think we as people understand hundreds of millions of dollars is kind of hard to calculate. But the way I calculate it, when you count everything except the property tax exemption, which would add a lot more, but all the other tax breaks and the cash we gave him and all the other stuff we provided is equivalent to a subsidy of $72 for every ticket to every game, including preseason games for the next 30 years. That's a pretty big favor for a business guy. He didn't really need the money. His team, he spent $600 million on. As of last month, Forbes magazine says it's now at $2.2 billion. Team value went up $600 million just this year with the stadium opening. But I don't know. I cannot prove that his contributions made a whit of difference in that. It may have happened anyway. He had he was doing a lot of lobbying, other things, and so on. I don't know. What I do know is that in other realms, people might say there's a conflict of interest there. In politics, everybody does it. It's accepted. That's the way you play the game. You're not going to win if you don't take some money. But let's take another realm, maybe one that Mr. Wilf would understand. Let's take the NFL. Supposing before the next Packers-Vikings game, he decided, he wants to be, he's a fair guy, he wants to help these guys, these officials. They don't get a lot of respect. So he gives $1,000 contributions to the officials. A lot of them have kids in college age, they could use the money. They don't get a lot of respect, so he gives $1,000 checks to them. You think the NFL would sit there and say, oh, we're going to watch those guys like a hawk? The fans would say, it's probably nothing, no big deal. I would care to bet. I actually asked a former NFL official about this, and he said, no, they probably would throw the team off the field and fire the official, and they'd forfeit the game. Why? It's a patently obvious conflict of interest. And we understand it in that one. I mean, nobody can question it, but nobody does it now. Right now we have rules as such that it doesn't happen in a lot of areas of life. Private businesses, they may have purchasers who have conflicts of interest and get favors from people who they purchase from. Most employers try and stamp that out because it's not a healthy situation. So money, I would argue, makes a huge difference. How does it make a difference? Well, first of all, do the people who make the donations believe in that? Do they believe it does? I don't know. I've never talked to Mr. Wilf about it. I don't have a clue whether he thinks it made a difference or not. The only one I can give you as an example, because he was very blunt in Time magazine, this is almost 20 years ago now, a guy named Charles Keating, during the savings and loan problem, his bank failure of Lincoln Savings and Loan in Omaha, I think it was, cost taxpayers, I think it was $1.5 billion or so. That's a lot of money. He made contributions to 5 U.S. senators, both parties. Again, it was not a partisan thing by any means. He made contributions to 5 U.S. senators, and in exchange for asking them favors to intervene with the regulators to stop them from shutting down his thing, which in the end it was just failing and they ended up shutting it down. But the delay in shutting it down cost taxpayers $1 billion extra, they were saying. And when he was being quoted in Time magazine, they asked him when he was, before some hearing, did he think his contributions made a difference? He said, I will say in the strongest possible words, I absolutely hope so. He expected them to make a difference, and he was doing it. Later on, he backed off of that because it looked kind of an ugly thing to say, and he said, I think I didn't use the most articulate words, but I think the problem was he used too articulate words. How does money affect the process? Well, I think it affects every impact. First of all, it determines who runs for office. I like picking races aren't current right now, so we think back. I think in the year 2000, the Republican Party, the two front-runners were George W. Bush and Elizabeth Dole. I've yet to hear a single person who thought Elizabeth Dole was not as articulate or more articulate than George Bush, smarter, more prepared for the office and so on. Why did she drop out? She couldn't raise the money. I don't have the access to the money. I remember plenty of cases in Democratic Party circles where candidates have said they can't run for president or other offices because they can't raise the money. It determines who runs for office. Second, it's a big factor in who wins elections. I can give you plenty of examples where the party who spent less won. My first race was that. I think that happens fairly frequently. But if you don't think that the money severely tilted, try and ask anybody who thinks it doesn't make a difference if they switch treasuries with the other candidate. They won't, because they realize they're raising money because it makes a difference. Third one is money is a big dominant factor in how candidates and officials view the issues and what their priorities are. Congressman Rick Nolan, who has the distinction of being the candidate who had the longest sabbatical from U.S. Congress, he served in the 1970s. He chose not to run in 1980 and came back 32 years later. He said that the difference was just absolutely incredible, the amount of time. He said in his first term in 1975, we were at 48 out of 52 weeks. Most of those days were 4 or 5 day weeks. We were in committee virtually every morning. We were on the floor, the House, throughout the afternoons and evenings. We were working in the process of governing, which is what we were elected to do. Now, he said, members of Congress now, to be successful, are expected to spend 30 hours a week in call time dialing for dollars. 30 hours a week. Rick Nolan and a Republican congressman from Florida introduced a bill actually to address that one thing, because both parties have these call centers right off of Capitol Hill. You go in there and you sit down and you dial and ask for $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 contributions. And you dial 20, 30 hours a week. He said that was the expectation the day you get there. And he and this other guy were saying that's really offensive to them and offensive to our process. But you're spending all your time talking to people who may be able to give you money, most of them not your constituents, because, of course, you want to get the money where the money is, and if your district has a certain number of people, you can call those 100 or 1,000 people at some point, but you're going to run out of them very quickly. You might as well hit the ones who you know give money, and you go where the money is, so they do that. And when you are talking to people who have certain interests, who want to give money because they want to be your friend, when you are talking to people who have that kind of money who they can give, you're not going to get the person who's struggling to make ends meet or pay off student loans. You're not going to get the average person you're supposed to represent. So you're not going to hear all of those concerns. Big money influences what issues are raised and how they're framed. One example I'll give on this is the Affordable Care Act. When it was signed into law, President Obama particularly called out the Senate author because he's the one who basically wrote, because if you remember the House things and so on, they had to quickly do it, so they took what the Senate language was. It was basically a bill written by Senator Max Baucus of Montana, a former senator. And Baucus, right at the news conference where the bill signing ceremony, he pulled out his chief aide, who he said she was the one who put the foundation together, who made all this stuff happen and so on. A woman named Liz Fowler. Who was Liz Fowler? She was the former vice president of WellPoint, the second largest health insurance company in the country. If you look at Max Baucus's contribution from the health industry, it was in the $250,000 range in a few years before the bill passed. Did the bill reflect a lot of interests of the insurance industry? Well, they'll say, no, they didn't get much of what they wanted. I think it was yesterday or today's paper said that United Health Group had record profits again last quarter, 2.2 billion, I think, in the last quarter. People see that, and I think the public understands that, and the public is frustrated by it. I'd say the money is not just influencing the process, it influences things after the process. Lobbying, it's not just giving money, it's the lobbying, it's the TV commercials, it's everything else. Several years ago, one of these grassroots lobbying things that we get lots of emails on, there was a thing on cell phone contract stuff that was to make sure contracts were fair to consumers. The legislator who produced the bill came to a hearing on it. I remember, and she was kind of dumbfounded by all the attacks on it, and everybody had gotten hundreds and hundreds of emails. What was it coming from? Well, it was ads from cell phone carriers to their people. This bill is going to raise, and they showed ads on TV, I remember showing all these government charges on your cell phone bill, as if that's what this bill was adding to. This bill was simply saying that contracts had to be in plain English. They couldn't have things with auto renewals. They couldn't have other things that were anti-consumer. And this woman comes in with her bill, and she's trying to explain why this is a good consumer protection thing, and 2/3 of the members of the committee are saying, oh, it's terrible, the public hates it. Well, the industry has the money to influence people that way every step of the way. So where does this come from? Why are we in this mess we're in? I start by saying that I've been working on this. I think my House members have been working on this in the past with me, and at some points we've had some successes. We've had too few and far between, but we succeeded in banning lobbyists and interest groups from giving us gifts. We capped the amount they could give us. We had a public finance system in place. We still do, but it's becoming less and less meaningful because all the outside money can overwhelm it, and the limits keep getting loosened up and other things happening. And trying to do something that I think we ought to look at is having, in a democracy, who should own the elected officials? I think it should be the public, which is why I make the argument we ought to have a publicly financed campaign system. That's the way we ought to do it. We ought to make it so if somebody's going to buy our politicians, it's us, the people. And the Supreme Court has basically been making that further and further from reality in recent years. I would say the biggest decision, the one that sort of set the framework from this, was in 1976, shortly after Minnesota passed its first campaign finance reform. In the 1970s, right after Watergate, Minnesota and a number of states and even U.S. Congress started passing campaign finance reforms. Watergate and scandals have this ability to make us act in politics. And people did respond, and I think they came up with some decent proposals. Things that aren't sufficient to deal with what we have now, but there was increased disclosure, there were limits, there was public financing available, all sorts of things that are designed to try and make sure we have a democratic process that's based on people and support for issues, not based on the money people have to spend. And in that 1976 Buckley-Vallejo decision, the court explained what the point of the First Amendment was, because they've said money is free speech under the First Amendment. Our First Amendment may be the most important amendment for a good reason. They described in the ruling the point of the First Amendment was designed, quote, to secure the widest possible dissemination of information from diverse and antagonistic sources. And it was to assure the unfettered interchange of ideas for bringing about the political and social changes desired by the people. I don't think I could explain any better the point of the First Amendment. We want ideas out there. I don't care how extreme they are, how dumb they are, how whatever they are. People should, it's a democracy. We have 300 some billion people in this country. We have 300 some million different ideas. And we should let those ideas come out there, and we should argue about them, debate them, and let the best ones win. And that's how the democratic process is supposed to work. What the court was wrong about was the impact of money. They understood that money can increase your ability to be heard. I can speak in here without a microphone, and I hope you can hear me. It's not a huge room. if you give me a bullhorn or a microphone, you might be able to be heard by 3, 4, 5 times as many people. You give me a broadcast television station, you might be able to be heard by millions of people. Money does magnify you. You own a newspaper, you've got the ability to get your word out more and more. Money clearly has an impact on speech. What the court got wrong was its impact on the First Amendment and what they say the point of the First Amendment is. More money, because we're doubling this, I think every 4 or 5 years, we're about doubling the amount of money spent in politics, which is pretty scary what you think that means now already and what it means in the future. But that money, when you double the amount of money, you don't double the amount of speech. You give me twice as much money for my campaign, you're not going to hear twice as much information. You're certainly not going to absorb twice as much information. There's a declining rate of return. Maybe you double it, and now you get 10% more, and so on. We're at the stage, I'd argue, where it's the more money spent, the less is heard. Why do I say that? Well, because it used to be people say, well, I don't pay much attention to politics until, well, you know, it's Labor Day, now I better start paying attention. That was the kickoff of the traditional fall campaign. Now, well, it's getting to be a few weeks before the election, or voting's open now, I better start paying attention. That's the way it used to be. Now, so many people, I'm so sick of this, I don't want to pay any attention to it. Now I've had so much of it already. The negative ads, the smear stuff, and the more money that comes into it doesn't give you more information. It's just repeating the same inane ads week after week after week. I don't watch a lot of TV, and I've seen enough in certain congressional races in Minnesota from both sides that the same ads. Keep thinking, after people have seen them 2 or 3 times, maybe you'd be better off changing your ads a little bit. But lack of creativity, but most of them don't tell you anything new about any candidate's position on the issue. 30 seconds is not a lot of time to do that. They usually tell you how evil the opponent is. And usually something that I think most of us would consider less than fully factual. So the more money being spent declines the amount, reduces the amount people absorb. They're just sick of it. It's just background noise and they ignore it. That's one problem. The other problem, the biggest one, is it crushes lots of points of view. I spend a lot of time on universal health care. I will guarantee you there's not a lot of interest groups willing to fund a cause like that. I can point out lots of them, people who are giving to Max Baucus's campaign. I can tell you the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical lobby, all kinds of groups have a financial stake in not letting something that rocks the boat, that changes their system, happen. So it crushes people's willingness to talk about certain issues. At the Capitol, why can't we have a rational discussion of sentencing reform, especially when both parties, I think in our forum last night, Alice or somebody, John Lash, mentioned that we are spending so much money on locking people up for long sentences for people who aren't really a danger to society, and it's not doing any good, it's not rehabilitating people, etc. It's like, why can't we change it? Because if I vote for that, they'll run attack ads against me over and over and over about how you were soft on crime. And the ads aren't truthful, but you know, you can see what, so everybody's trying to vote for things or not vote on things that are going to put them at risk of being attacked. Because it's the attacks that are going to scare people up. So it totally corrupts what we talk about. And so what I would argue is the court's unlimited spending actually goes against all of the purposes of the First Amendment. Getting diversity of points of view out there, making sure they're all heard and everything else. That the way we ought to do it is have total reform in the way we do it. Say that, you know, first of all, non-human entities, whether corporations, labor unions, any other groups, human-created entities, they have value in society. We want them, but they should not have, and they do not deserve, constitutional rights. They deserve the rights and responsibilities we, as the public, give them through law, the responsibilities, the requirements, the opportunities we give them. And when corporations were first created in this country, they were given legislatively at the federal level and at states, they were given charters that had a fixed period of time and then they expired. Your corporation was not a permanent entity. And we've given them now the point that this is that Frankensteinish monster that we can't control anymore. They have more power than we do. They can spend their money on electing our officials even though they have no right to vote. Bill Moyers, who's good with these lines, said once, he'll believe a corporation is a human when Texas executes one of them. And given the fact that corporations at one time were not permanent things, you know, if a corporation does really horrendous things, maybe we ought to execute their charge and say they don't have a right to exist anymore. But the courts have made those decisions that that's the case. So how do you move forward? I wrap it up and open it for discussion in a minute. How do you move forward? I think there are two things we can do. First of all, for the court interpretations, courts change. Right now we've got 8 members and they can't decide much of anything. Now we're being told that the next president's nominees may not be even considered. Well, I don't know how far we can go with that before we have no Supreme Court and nobody to adjudicate these things. It's not a very good long-term plan. But I'm very scared about that. The courts do change and do change their minds. Sometimes the public amends the Constitution, changing it for them. Other times the court catches on. Best example I'll give is Plessy versus Ferguson. I think it was 1896. That was the separate but equal constitutional ruling. It was not till 1954 where the Supreme Court unanimously decided that was wrong, and they changed it. We don't have 60 years to change something that's corrupting our political process and selling elections off to the highest bidder. We don't have that long, and so I hope we can see change in the court. I think we ought to be able to, but we haven't had anybody making those arguments out there about the fundamental thing. We just have the courts say, oh, money is free speech, you can't restrict it. Well, maybe we can do a little bit here, so we tinker around the edges. I think we have to have nationally a frontal assault on that decision to say, we want to clarify the Constitution. Maybe everybody thinks money should be the determining factor. I don't think the public buys that. I will quote Common Cause, the citizens group in 1996 in Minnesota, the only poll I've seen on something like this. They had a professional poll done, and they asked the question, are politicians more responsive to campaign contributors than to voters who do not contribute? It wasn't too close, it was 88% to 6%, the rest undecided. About a 12-to-1 decision favoring the idea that money does talk, and politicians who are supposed to be representing the public are more representative of the people who give them money, the interests that give them money. So I think the public would support that. I think that's a good thing to discuss. I think that's what our democratic process is about. I've actually got a bill that's passed the Senate a couple of times in the last 3 years. That's a petition to the U.S. Congress to say they should pass this amendment proposal that Congressman Rick Nolan is the chief author of. He's got the same language we have here, and it basically says that money is not free speech, and that the legislature and Congress and city councils and everyone shall regulate campaign financing so that no person has substantially more clout than anybody else because of their money. And number 2, that corporations and other non-human entities, labor unions, other things, are not people for constitutional rights, and they have the rights and responsibilities given to them by law. To me, those are clarifications of the Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court would say, no, that would be a change, but that's what we ought to be discussing. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, first of all, I think we do keep pushing those both in Congress, and I think we should push it here in Minnesota. That it's a group called Move to Amend has been backing it. We changed the language they were using some, but they like what we're doing. And I think they understand why it's important. Number 2, one of the things the League of Women Voters has always pushed very hard for is disclosure. That's not sufficient. It's not sufficient to do it. The fact that somebody can come in and give $1 million in a race and influence the race beyond anybody who even lives in that community who's voting on them to do it, that's not sufficient to have disclosure. But disclosure is a step forward. And even though the court said in Buckley decision and in Citizens United that, well, they don't need these limits because disclosure is sufficient, and disclosure is important, they've actually ruled against disclosure in many cases as well, so we're limited somewhat in what we can do. But Minnesota and other states should be doing this. These super PACs are basically totally undisclosed, totally hidden, dark money. Nobody knows where it comes from. Nobody knows who's influencing, and it's always innocent-sounding things. I mean, Citizens United was the name of the PAC who spent the money in that one case, and it was not a citizen group. Seniors for Better Medicare was funded by the pharmaceutical lobby, arguing, I would argue, against seniors on Medicare. But we should have disclosure. Second of all, we should do everything we can to keep our limits and public finance. Minnesota's had a decent public finance system. I'm troubled by the fact that leaders of both parties fight against improving it. We used to have a refundable contribution thing, so ordinary people could give $50 and get it refunded. At one point it was actually $100, and you could get the money refunded, which gave ordinary people a chance to participate in the process that way. I'd be happy just with full public financing, because I think that would be a better way to do it, but those things were good processes, but the people in power, and right now with the Senate it's the DFL, and the House it's the Republicans, they don't want to change the rules because they got the power under the current system. So incumbents don't like to change the rules. But there is hope, I think. Our laws actually give a higher spending limit to non-incumbents, to challengers. My opponent is allowed to spend, and if it's a competitive race, they probably would, allowed to spend 10% more. If they have a close primary, 20% more, several other things. But I think public dollars going into elections is one of the best buys we could have in our democracy. And I know that it's not just some Democratic thing, as a DFLer happened to support it. Right after the 1992 election, I took charge of the Senate Government Ethics and Campaign Finance Reform Committee. And I remember having a bill that would have eliminated all contributions to $100 or less, no PAC, no lobbyist money, no soft money, just public financing and small individual contributions. And the Ross Perot, United We Stand America, he had just lost the election. He had the folks, they were a grassroots group of folks, largely older male white guys who were angry at the system. We have that come in many forms here and there since that time. Tea Party, Occupy movement were similar to that. There are people who are angry at the process. They came in, they liked my bill, they wanted to rock the system, and they wanted to endorse my bill. And this is kind of an unusual group. It's sort of a third party and sort of not, and I kind of pushed them off a little bit. I wasn't that interested and so on. But they insisted, they really liked what I was talking about. So they even agreed to come to the Capitol. They got 30, 40 people and sat down with me, gave me an hour to present my bill. I spent 15 minutes on it, maybe 5 minutes on what the bill did, and then 15 minutes on explaining why, in order for it to happen, if we're going to restrict this money, we have to replace it with other money. So what I'm asking you to support is something that would take your money and give it to political candidates, many of whom you can't stomach, because that's the way you have to do it. I said, I don't want your support for just the limitations on here, because realistically, if you just put limitations in and don't make the system work, people are going to find loopholes and push their way around it. And I said goodbye to a half hour later, they sought me out and said, we unanimously endorse the entire bill, we want to support it. And these guys sat in our hearings. I was chairing the committee, so it was awkward because the Senate Majority Leader, Assistant Majority Leader, Minority Leader, Tax Committee Chair, all the powerful figures were on the committee, which was stacked so they couldn't do anything. Nevertheless, I had more hearings on that bill than any bill in state history, I think. It went through till the second committee deadline, and we got some things out of it, mainly because these guys were sitting in the room, and every time somebody would offer an amendment that was going to take away, they said, you know, clearing their throat, making it clear, and the reporters would come running up there to see what was happening, and somebody would withdraw the amendment. This went on for weeks. This was a very conservative group of people who were cynical about government, and they kind of understood why we ought to own our own political process. With that, I will open it up for discussion or comments or whatever. Thank you very much.
We have questions.
So because of the story you concluded with, do you have any hope that given how people are disgusted with this particular campaign, that there will be perhaps some renewed interest in taking some of that money out?
I hope so. What scares me about it is that there's no way to get, we have a League of Women Voters Forum here. It's not something that you have the mass is hearing that. The media, our democracy has a lot of weaknesses, and one of them is we don't have a good system for getting honest messaging out. The internet's great for getting out a lot of messages, but it's a jumble, and people can corrupt the messages in many ways. And what scares me is that when, I think in the House, I think when the Move to Amend proposal came up, it was pulled from the floor because a whole lot of the big, most powerful interest groups, some on both sides of the aisle, fought against it because they don't want to restrict their ability to give money. And I mean, NRA was there, both sides of the abortion issue, I think there were some there. People are, I think it was more certain groups than others, but a lot of people were very concerned that we were going to limit their ability to have speech. And to me, no, we cannot constitutionally limit the ability of individuals to speak and for groups to work together. And I can tell you groups that I strongly support and so on, and I don't take money from them just because I'm trying to use that as an example. But I think there is hope. I think you wouldn't be doing what you're doing, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if we didn't think there was a chance to make a difference. I think it's an uphill battle, but every now and then a scandal comes up. It does worry me that that poll of 88-6 on do you think politicians are more influenced by money than ordinary voters, which is one of the reasons a lot of people don't vote. What difference does my vote make? But I do think people fundamentally understand that. It's just when it gets corrupted by heavy mailings and advertising, everybody saying so-and-so is trying to take away our rights to speak on this. But yes, I am hopeful.
John, do you think there's any chance of shortening the time of the election?
Yes, not a lot, and part of it is the money. You cannot, I mean, I remember from before my time, reading in the 1950s how Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson were being talked into running in the beginning of the election year for President of the United States. And then when Jimmy Carter started, like 2 or 3 years out, I mean, that was unheard of. Now candidates start many, many years out in planning and everything else. And with the money out there, you can't do it. Every time they try and do the primary earlier and earlier, I keep arguing. I put out a phony news release saying how Joe at so-and-so's bake shop in Nisswa is really, the guys there at the bake shop are all talking about how we really want these earlier elections because we don't get enough politics in those last few months. We want the TV ads to start in January instead of March. I think the public would welcome that. I think it's a hard thing to do in terms of saying you can't organize now. But frankly, if we had the money limited, I don't think you'd have people. Why do you do it? Well, because you can't possibly afford a TV ad now, and the rates are so much higher because it's an election year, and the TV stations they make millions off it. And so if you had less money, if candidates were all given about equal money, they're going to measure it, and I think they'd be spending most of their money in September, October. You can do other things like put in public funding requirements, have debates, and have candidates have to give them free time on the air for 5-minute speeches, not ads showing pictures of their opponent. But you could do a number of things to do it which would compress it very quickly, but without limiting the money in any way, shape, or form. I think candidates figure their one leg up is to start earlier. And it's perpetual campaigns, and I think the public would be sick of it if it was the same style of campaigns for 3 months, but it should be a little more bearable, and I think you'd clean up a lot of other problems with the money too.
I'll ask one,
Go ahead.
John. I just wondered, with your Citizens United ideas, and for whatever it's worth, I testified against them and found out I was wrong. Would it be better to attack a part of that grouping rather than the whole? And what I'm thinking is this, that it would seem to me the most obvious potential, I can't remember the word now, but payback for a organization would be a public union. That would be, you know, everything would stays public and circular. What do you think of that, number one? And two, this is off that, but it's just an idea I've had along the way. I wondered, bounce it off you. What would you think? It seems like all the states, including Minnesota, it's all in for electoral votes for the presidential elections. What would you think of us passing a law, or y'all passing a law, that would give a percentage to each candidate of the electoral votes of the state?
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Two questions. Yes, the first one, what about limiting some of the things? That's where you get to the fact that you have to have, what I'd like to have is a fair process. I don't take money from labor unions or business community or environment or anti-environment or pro this or pro that. I don't think we should be having any of them influence the process. And I can guarantee you that I don't think 5,000 people making small contributions to a PAC is worse than one person making the same size contribution on their own. And so I've tried over the years, I've said, you know, I think in terms of having a fair process, you can't say, because everybody's going to try and do it. I've seen both parties try and, Republicans tend to try and say, let's just ban the PAC money because that tends to be more labor and other things, though there are Republican PACs, certainly. Democrats would rather do certain other things. I remember a number of years ago, one tried to make it so that we take the check off, which gives money to candidates based on the support in their districts. Wanted to do that, a statewide average, which at the time meant more money would go to Democrats than Republicans, statewide, even though it didn't reflect that the district court said you couldn't do that. Good reason. You shouldn't be, I'm not trying to get a system that's going to favor one party or the other, and I'm very concerned about that, and frankly, I don't think the public would support it. I don't think they'd say, well, we can't pool our money together as a PAC, and everybody else is allowed to give it. If I got $1 million, I can give $1 million. If you get 1,000 people to give small contributions, they can't give you $5,000. I don't think that makes the system fair. I'm trying to get a fairer system, and I think you have to look at the big picture. On the second one, the electoral votes, the difficulty again then becomes in a state like Minnesota, which has voted in the last 6, 7, 8 presidential elections, has voted for a DFL candidate or Democratic candidate for president. If you say, okay, well, we'll give, even if the Democratic candidate wins Minnesota, we'll only give 6 of our 10 votes to that candidate, and then the states, other states that have a narrow Republican win, oh, they're going to give 100% to their candidate. So you get the problem with that. There's one group that's actually thought of a creative way of addressing this, and they're saying, we as states make a compact. We will say, we will give all of our, they want to make it to the majority winner of the popular vote. National Popular Vote, I think is the name of their campaign. They put out a thick book they handed all of us that I don't think anybody could read because they didn't have that much interest in the issue. But their theory was that if we get enough states to control 270 electoral votes who will commit in law to saying that their electoral votes will go to the national winner of the popular vote, as long as there's a binding commitment in enough states that will sway the election, then they will do that. I'd favor something like that. I think that's reasonable. I think we should just amend the Constitution myself, because I don't think the state should be the voting factor. The Electoral College is an outdated system, and frankly, the small states, the state with a 500,000 people population has 3 electoral votes. We have 10 times that many people, and we get 10. They get 1/3 as much representation for one. Their votes count 3 times as much. Electoral College does not make a lot of sense to me, but I favor it, but I don't want to do it in a way that tilts it. I would think a state that votes Republican, most elections in presidential race would not want to do that, and I don't think a Democratic state would want to do it. We either have to change it for everyone or a fair system, otherwise you're saying, well, we're going to disadvantage the candidate we vote for and let everybody else keep doing it. You either have to do it nationally or you deal with it that way.
I'm just starting to read your book. I've been on vacation, but I'm close to finishing it up on healthcare reform, and that's something you worked on a lot, and I'm wondering if you could assess how much the fact that we don't have a public plan nationally, that we don't have the single payer, ties in with the problems with financing campaigns.
I would argue that almost every issue we touch, not everyone, but almost every issue we touch is influenced by the money. And that is certainly a big one. My proposal, I think everything people say they want to have a choice of their doctor, and their nurses and their clinics and their dentists and their chiropractor. They want to have decisions made by them and their medical providers, not by some insurance company or not by government. All of those things that are in this proposal, I think the public overwhelmingly supports. And the idea that it actually is likely to be cheaper, well, why doesn't it have a chance? I'd say the biggest obstacle to it right now is not directly the financial interests that oppose it. I think the biggest obstacle right now is a lot of people who say, oh yeah, I'd support it, but it doesn't have a chance, partly because of the big money and partly because, frankly, insurance industry doesn't just give to one party or the other, they give to both parties. I always tell people, you can tell who's got a financial stake at the Capitol. Most people, I know lots of people who support some Democratic candidates, some Republican ones, might call them independents. But very few people say, I'm going to give to both John Marty and his opponent. And there are plenty of people who do that. And there are plenty of groups that do that, and there's some that give money to both parties. I mean, it's kind of hard to make the case that, well, I really like both candidates, but to say, I want to give to both the Republican and the DFL party. The people who do that are lobbying or they have some financial stake, and the insurance industry does that, and it's amazing. I hear people always under their breath, always in closed rooms, always that, both parties who kind of say, well, you know, we got to support this because these guys have been good to us. And that's on the edge of, hey, this is influencing me and we're letting it happen. I'd say a big example of that is the guy on the payday lending scam. He gives money to both parties, a lot more to one party than the other, but enough to make sure both parties don't turn him off. And I'd say in campaign finance reform, I mean, what I'm saying is I think we need a healthcare system that works for people, and I think if you ask people what they want out of healthcare, very few of them say they want more paperwork. And
Then you could tell them how to get your book.
oh, I have a new book out, he's texting as well, and people can get it online, ebook free, at mnhealthplan.org, and I can get you others, the publisher, I think they're online at Amazon. You have to go to Amazon. Healing Healthcare is the name of the book. But you can get e-version of it free. And let me know if you're interested. Yeah.
If you were to give this presentation to a room full of millennials, what are some things you would say to them, given the cynicism that we're experiencing?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the one thing I've noticed, when I first was elected, I was of that age group. Now I spent half my life in the Senate as a business member. And it really does shock me. When I used to go speak, and I think all legislators speak at high schools and colleges and so on, and when you speak to them, it was always, yeah, young people want to get involved and they want to do this, and so on. Now it's kind of, why would I care? They really have gotten to the point that is scary to me. And the thing I'd say differently is I probably wouldn't tell stories about Charles Keating. Of course, some of them, like Floyd Penrose 100 years ago, are still worth quoting. But I would tell a little bit different stories. But the other thing I'd say is, you know, somehow we've got this thing, government is the enemy. And if you look up what a government is in whether a democracy or not, a government is the way a society chooses to allocate resources, chooses to make decisions, chooses to decide what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, how neighbors relate, how we relate in property rights, how we relate in speech, how we relate in finances and everything else, how how we get from place to place, how we get our water, how we get everything else. That's what government does. That's us. And in a democracy, we get the choice to make those things. And we've gotten to the point now where people are so cynical. The most depressing evidence of this I saw recently was, I think it was Sunday Star Tribune, when they talked about 5,000 candidates for local office in Minnesota.
Yeah.
7% there is no candidate running, period.
Wow.
60% more have only one unopposed candidate. It's only 1/3 of the races, 33%, where they have 2 or more candidates. Or like in Roseville, 3 candidates for 2 seats. Where there's any choice whatsoever, there's only 33% of the races. What do you do in a democracy when everybody gives up? And I don't know how to say it strongly enough, but that's what I'd say to younger folks is, you know, whether you like it or not, government's where decisions are made. And if you don't like it, you should work to change it. But that's why it is a scary time. And again, I think League of Women Voters wouldn't have been around as long as you have been if it wasn't for the fact that people think we can build a better future and that democracy matters. And frankly, I think those of us who run for public office understand that. That's why we keep doing it. But when people see, I don't want to have my name smeared in the papers, I don't want to have ads running attacking me for being a crook. If these are first-time candidates at legislative level get attacked by both parties for so-and-so's friends want to do this, take away your Medicare, so-and-so wants to do this. Things that are as untrue as they could be without being provable lies. And I think that we have to reawaken the sense that democracy matters. That's why I was so excited about last night's candidate forum. It was a civil event, and we actually discussed issues. I wish there were more of them, and so on. But we have to change it. So my message to young folks would be trying to say, hey, wake up, because they've been told a lot of stuff, and a lot of the negative things they've been told are true, but the only way to change them is not to go home. It's to stay in.
Kind of piggyback on that question is a lot of underserviced people who have 2, 3, 4 jobs just to kind of keep the bills don't have the luxury to come here and listen to you and go to the public forums, and don't even have the luxury to go to the kids' conferences to meet the teachers. So to me, there has to be a way where you can engage those people and get them to come and get involved. So I'm not asking for a solution, but how can, they're not going to be able to donate to you or donate to somebody, but a lot of the decisions that are made for them,
they are the ones who are most influenced by the shape of the economy.
So
Right.
do
They are most
people
shaped.
consider them?
Right.
Are they even considered in these decisions?
They are, I would argue they're not considered very much in politics because they don't vote and they don't whatever else, which is
Or they're
the
not
point.
allowed to vote?
Or they're not allowed to vote. The point of the democratic process, I don't see my job is trying to get reelected and trying to do things that please people who vote for me. I see my job is trying to have a fair system. And I think that's what's sorely lacking. And again, I think there are a lot of people, you look at the Iron Range, you see people who were very heavily for Bernie Sanders who are now, many of them voting for Donald Trump. Why? Well, they're scared. They think the economy is leaving them behind. I'd say the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movements, 4 or 5 years apart in their birth, were very similar in people who are disgusted. They don't think the economy doesn't work for them. And I spoke at I was debating at the Center for the American Experiment about a month ago on minimum wage, which was not particularly my crowd. I know there was one other guy in the room who agreed with me, but I told them I think we have a crisis. And I said that in Minneapolis, where the event was held, I said in Minneapolis, 1/4 of the people live in poverty. Almost 1/2, 48% of African American Minneapolitans live in poverty.
Wow.
And if you don't think living in poverty is a crisis, you haven't been there, because frankly, if you're trying to keep your kids and you've been bumped out of your house and you're either staying in a car or you're couch hopping or something else, you're struggling. And yes, you don't have time to think about the broader world and so on. And the economy doesn't work. And I told them, I remember from my childhood where you had often one wage earner in a family, usually the male at the time. And they were often not skilled jobs. They were gas station attendants, they were retail clerks, they were elevator operators even. I mean, they were not high-skilled jobs, but they were making enough, maybe not a lot, but they were making enough that they had a roof over their head and so on in most cases. It wasn't perfect, I don't want to pretend it was. But in many cases, people were making it on one-income families. And nowadays, you have two heads of a household working 2 or 3 retail jobs and they can't make ends meet. And to me, those folks, they're pushed out of the system because they can't afford to be involved. And the political process seems to not care that much. My pitch to them was, look, I happen to think higher wages is the obvious way that someone who's working doesn't live in poverty, which again, a poll on that one said like 94% agree with the statement that no working person, someone who's working full-time should not be living in poverty. And I said, if you don't believe in wages doing it, because these were largely business owners, oh, this will really hurt. And I gave them all these examples from Seattle and the national studies that show it doesn't have that kind of an impact. It has an impact on any individual business, but overall on the economy it does not take away, even in the retail and hospitality industries where it's predominantly low-wage workers. And I told them, if you don't want to do it that, there are other ways we can do it. We can do it through earned income tax credit, we can do it through housing assistance, we can do it through healthcare assistance, other things. I said, but you guys don't like that because that's all public money. And I say, you either have to say we want to do something about it, or you can say, I just don't care. And I think there are a lot of people who say they don't care, but a lot of people really do care. And I have an abiding faith that most people really do care about their neighbors. And their neighbors who are not the same. And last night's candidate forum, when we talked about immigrants, it was a very obvious thing. After any natural disaster, you see people who are hurting, who don't have enough themselves, helping somebody else. So we are not going to get those folks actively engaged quickly because of lack of time. But if the political process doesn't look out for their interest, you know, if more than a quarter of the kids in Minneapolis are growing up in poverty, you recognize what that's doing to their brain development, what they're doing to their education. Those are the folks who are going to be making the economy work in the future. It's in all of our interest to do that. So. Anything else? I'll be glad to stay around and talk with individuals for a few minutes.
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming. Please stay around, and especially introduce yourselves to each other, for those of you that are not in. And Mindy, would you mind just mentioning the November what's coming up?
Right. November, we're going to be meeting right here in the same place. This is going to be kind of our standard place to meet for all except for general meetings. The unit meetings Tuesday night will always be here. And our guest, or our speaker, is Roseville resident Ellen Shelton. She was on our school board back a long time ago when I was on the school board. And right for the last 20 plus years, she's been working at Wilder as a research scientist, and she's coming to start us out on our housing study. So she has worked on many studies at Wilder, but one of them is on homelessness. So she will bring us facts and figures of homelessness in our 5 suburban cities, and also St. Paul. And St. Paul League of Women Voters is co-sponsoring this meeting with us. So they will be coming as well. We might need a few more chairs, but so we're going to be learning about homelessness and why we need to care about housing and get involved in our 5 cities. The housing committee, study committee, many of whom are here, has been working all summer and into the fall now on learning about affordable housing. Representative Alice Hausman just hosted a meeting this very day with Rebecca Borman and myself, where we were talking with the Housing Commissioner, Mary Tinkerfell, about housing and affordable housing. So come prepared to start learning about housing. In February then we have a panel that Alice Hausman will be on with others to tell us more about affordable housing. And then in April, we'll be having our final report. And we actually have got some University of Minnesota graduate capstone students who are going to help us analyze the data from the Met Council on the types and availability of affordable housing in our 5 cities. And, you know, we can compare them to each other based on how much of each type do they have. And that will be very fascinating. Excuse me, depending on our annual meeting, the next year then, we will be looking at advocacy and advocating in our 5 cities, either to go and compliment them on what they're doing or tell them what others are doing who are doing better and how they could do better too. So I just really, the league has been involved in housing for a long time, so long that when Beth Salzel's dad was the mayor of Roseville, we were haranguing him and he actually worked with us. And so Beth is interested enough nowadays to be on our housing committee. So this is a long interest of the League of Women Voters. And so come in November and get started.